Hey everybody, in this video we are talking about multipliers, specifically the spending multiplier and the tax multiplier. Now, right from the beginning, I want you to understand, guys, here at Econ Busters, we are not big fans of the tax multiplier. We think you can handle changes in taxes with the spending multiplier very easily in a conceptual way, and you don't need to fill your head with another formula. But in this video, we are going to cover the tax multiplier. We're going to show you the formula for the tax multiplier and even how to use that formula correctly. But we're also going to show you don't need it and why you don't need it. Okay, so let's get going. First of all, I want you to orient yourself to what we have on the board, which is a portion of a circular flow model. First thing I want to point out is that is not the factor market. That is the financial market. We would put the factor market or resource market up here. We're also might not be able to see it, kind of pivot really kind of a funky way here. Businesses would go right here, okay? So you would have that circular flow, you'd have that revenues to businesses, and then you'd have cost and profit to the resource market. You'd have wages, rent, interest, and profits to the households. You'd have those income flows here, and then you'd have, there it is, consumption, and there is the savings, okay? The other thing to see, guys, is these are green arrows representing money flows. So that's the government purchases, that's the money going that way. Goods and services, of course, would go the opposite direction. Again, this is consumption going in, so the goods and services would go that way. Again, we are not showing the goods and services, we're only showing the money flows. Make sure we've covered everything: government, households, okay, product, market, and again, this is just a portion of the circular flow model. But there you go. Hopefully you are oriented to it. Now, let's get to the rest of it, okay? First of all, what is the spending multiplier? Well, one way to say that is it is 1 over the MPS. That MPS is the marginal propensity to save. We like to write it right here, MPS. It is the percent of any additional dollar disposable income that heads this way. There's also, of course, a marginal propensity to consume. Marginal propensity to consume. That is the percent of any additional dollar disposable income that heads this way. If you add these two together, you get 1, because every dollar disposable income only goes to either here or here. There's only 2 paths for it, right? It goes either to savings or it goes to consumption, which is a type of spending. Now, many people might represent the spending multiplier as 1 over 1 minus the MPC. I want to tell you why we're going to represent it as 1 over MPS, because we think it's more conceptual. Let me tell you why. Guys, why is there a spending multiplier? Why is it that when we get an initial change in spending, that initial change in spending gets multiplied into more and more rounds of spending, and therefore it increases nominal GDP more than the initial change in spending? Why is that? Because we have a circular flow economy. Spending right here flows into income, which flows into spending, which flows into income, which flows into spending. A circular flow economy. One person's spending turns into another person's income, which then turns into spending, which then turns into somebody else's income. Okay, that circular flow economy is why there is a spending multiplier to begin with. And here's the thing, guys, we're going to focus on one major leakage to the circle, and that is savings, okay? So the MPS, it's hurting the spending multiplier. If the MPS gets bigger, we're going to get less of a multiplication effect because more is leaking out, okay? This is our leakage away from spending. So if you take the inverse of the leakage away from spending, you get the spending multiplier. Let me say that again. This is the thing that's hurting spending. So if we take the inverse of it, you get the spending multiplier. Okay, let's give some example numbers. For this whole video, we're going to say 0.2 right here and 0.8. In fact, you should know that, right? If I say 0.2, you're already thinking, hopefully, hey, that's got to be 0.8, because add these two together and it equals 1. So with that said, we're going to say, okay, that makes this 1 over 0.2. 0.2 is 1/5, by the way. So 1 over 0.2 or 1/5 equals 5, and that's what people would say the spending multiplier is in the particular problem with an MPS of 0.2. But we want people to understand that is a ratio, okay? 5 over 1 is 5. It's a ratio. Just like this is a ratio, that's the same ratio, of course, okay? And that is what we want to think about. Why is that? what it's telling us is for every initial change in spending of $1, we're going to get a total change in spending, a total change in nominal GDP, you can say it either way, of $5. Let me say that one more time. This is our initial, for every initial change in spending of $1. Every time we get an initial change in spending of $1, okay, sometimes that's called an autonomous change in spending or a round one change in spending, we will get a total change in spending of $5. And so what that means is we'll be presented with problems, okay? And we are probably going to be given either the MPC or the MPS, and we're going to be asked to find, of course, the multiplier, and then we're going to be given either an initial change in spending or the total change in spending. What do I mean by that? We might be given a problem that says, hey, if government purchases increased by 100 billion, so an increase in government purchases of 100 billion is a round one impact. That's an initial change in spending of 100 billion, an autonomous change in spending of 100 billion. So we put our 100 billion right there, and then the problem would say, what would be the total change in spending? And we just solved this, and that makes this 500 billion. Another problem, of course, could say, hey, you know, the MPC is 0.8, okay, makes the MPS 0.2, okay, we got our spending multiplier, and they say, hey, we need to get a $500 billion change in GDP. Maybe the output gap is $500 billion. How much do we need to change government purchases? Well, that problem is giving you the total change in spending, 500 billion, and it's asking for how much you need to change government purchases, which is your round one or initial change in spending. Again, autonomous change in spending. Those are all the same things, autonomous, initial, round one. And so you would just solve this and you say, oh, okay, that comes out to 100 billion. So there you go. We've got the spending multiplier, kind of know how to use it. In the top part is the total change in spending. Here is our initial change in spending, and we hopefully see how that relates to the spending multiplier, which again, we like to say is a ratio, okay? It's a number over one. Okay, with that said, probably should have had an eraser, but that's okay. Use my fingers right there. We get a different problem, let's say. Let's say we get a problem that we lower, okay, so decrease taxes by $100 billion. And then they say, what would be our total impact on GDP? So they lower taxes by $100 billion. What's the total impact on GDP? First thing is, you cannot take this $100 billion and throw it up here as the initial change in spending, because taxes, as I like to say, are not spending. And that $100 billion is not going to be our initial change in spending. Spending happens down here at the product market, okay? We're gonna have to track that $100 billion to the product market. Before I do that, I want to say a little other thing that some kids get a little bit messed up on. When we lower taxes by 100 billion, some students think, okay, government purchases have to go down by 100 billion. No, they do not, okay? These can very much be separate pieces of legislation, okay? When we change taxes, it's very important that students understand, if it doesn't say anything about government purchases, assume government purchases are remaining the same. Remember, guys, the government can always go over here to the financial market and borrow money. They can always run deficits, okay? I'm not gonna get into that in this video. It's not really important in this video. I just want you to know when they change taxes, do not think that this has to change unless the problem says this changes, okay? But what we do need to understand is when they change taxes, disposable income changes. That is really big, okay? And that's just true for the entire course of macroeconomics. When we change taxes, what we are trying to do generally is change disposable income. Now, if taxes go down by 100 billion, I think every student would say, hey, that makes it so disposable income is actually going to go up by 100 billion, right? Extra 100 billion is going to make it all the way through, right? We're going to have $100 billion less leaking out as taxes right here. So an extra 100 billion is going to make it through. Disposable income goes up by 100 billion. Again, lower taxes raises disposable income. Now we simply have to take it through the fork in the road. The fork in the road is so important. MPS 0.2, MPC 0.8. Of that 100 billion, 20 billion is going to go that way. 80 billion is going to go that way, right? 0.2 is 20% of that is going to go this way. We can do that. 100 billion, 20% of that. Hey, that's 20 billion. 0.8, 80% of that is going to go this way. That's, again, $80 billion. There it is, guys. That is our initial change in spending. Again, that wasn't very hard. We lower taxes. We know that raises disposable income by the same amount. We just take it through the fork in the road. That's all we need to do. We get our initial change in spending of a positive 800 billion because disposable income went up. We throw that right here, $80 billion. We solve this, and this comes out to $400 billion, okay? Not the nicest 8, but hopefully you can tell that's an 8. There you go. You just handled a tax change with the spending multiplier. We didn't even talk about the tax multiplier yet. That's all you need to do. But let's go ahead and talk about that tax multiplier. What is the tax multiplier? The tax multiplier is MPC, actually a negative MPC over MPS. Okay, there it is. That is the tax multiplier, okay? Now, what you would do if you were asked a problem is you would say, okay, taxes went down by 100 billion, and since they said taxes were reduced by 100 billion, you would say, okay, since they were reduced, I need to keep my negative sign. So I take my negative 100 billion since taxes went down, and I multiply it by this thing, okay, which is a negative number. So I've got a negative times a negative, which is going to come out to a positive number, okay, which we already knew, 400 billion. And let's go ahead and talk about what this week outside the negative side, and what would this give you? Well, MPC is 0.8, right? MPS is 0.2. So 0.8 divided by 0.2 is 4, right? So you've got a negative 4. So the tax multiplier is a negative 4. So you take your negative 4 again times your negative 100 billion, and again, it comes out to what we already knew, a positive 400 billion. But that's not what you would do. That is what you would do if you wanted to use the tax multiplier. One more time, guys. You would just say, okay, taxes went down by 100 billion. Let's multiply it against my tax multiplier. I guess I've memorized my tax multiplier. There it is. Multiply the two together, and there's my answer. Remember, if taxes go down, you need to put a negative number here, and this is a negative number. That's right, the tax multiplier is a negative number, okay? So that is one way you could do it, okay? And by the way, just a real quick one here, guys. Remember, if we do government purchases of 100 billion, that was 500 billion. Let me say that again. When we did the government purchases of 100 billion, this was 500 billion. So one thing you notice right off the bat is government purchases have a bigger impact on GDP than taxes, okay? Another thing you might notice is the spending multiplier is 5, the tax multiplier is a negative 4. That's actually always going to be the case. The difference is always going to be 1, and you're going to have to change it to a negative sign, okay? But anyhow, again, you didn't really need it. In fact, take a look at that. Take a kind of a close look at that, okay? I'm going to ignore the negative sign for quite a bit, but for just a moment here, okay? Because I think we can handle the negative sign without having a negative sign in our formula. I'll talk about that in just a second. But take a look at this. This is just MPC times 1 over MPS. Well, there it is. There's our spending multiplier. So it's just MPC times 1 over MPS. Well, that's exactly what we did. We basically took the tax change of 100 billion, we multiplied it by the MPC to find our initial change in spending, and then once we got our initial change in spending, we multiplied it by our spending multiplier. That's basically what we did. So all they're doing is putting that together. And then again, the negative sign, which drives us a little bit crazy here at Econ Busters. When we lower taxes, we think it is not too much for students to understand, hey, when you lower taxes, disposable income goes up. And so you're going to get an increase in spending, positive impact on GDP. In fact, that's a very important thing for students to know outside of just doing multipliers, okay? If you raise taxes, disposable income is going to go down, and you're going to be contracting the economy, GDP is going to go down. We think we can just understand that conceptually. We don't need these negative signs out there that we're putting together and just being so formulaic in our approach, okay? So here's what we think you can do when you get a tax change. Exactly what we already did. You get a tax change of a negative 100 billion. You might be like a little bit confused right now, okay? Here's what we think you should do. You get a tax change of 100 billion. Hey, disposable income, guess what? It changed by 100 billion. Hopefully we get that down. And then you just say, look, with disposable income, we either what? Save or spend. If I know my MPS is 0.2, I understand what an MPS is. It is my propensity, okay, to take this to savings. So 20% of this is going to go to savings. We can do that. That's 20 billion going that way. And hey, if this is 0.8, 80% of that, okay, is going to go this way. And we can do that. 100 billion times 0.8, that's 80 billion. And what did I say that was? That's your initial change in spending. I think we can do that. Get a change here. That changes this by the same amount. Take it through the fork in the road. Find your what? Initial change in spending. And then just use the spending multiplier. Again, there it is. There's the tax multiplier. Okay, you can use it, but you don't need to use it. You just need to find the initial change in spending, and if you understand kind of how the economy works, then it's not that hard to do. Hope that makes sense to you. We'll see you in the next video.